My daughter-in-law, the woman who threw me out of my own home just 5 days ago, is now on her knees in the pouring rain, begging me to save her husband's life. Her $3,000 handbag is soaked, her perfect makeup is ruined by tears, and the name flashing on her phone is the reason she's terrified. And me? I just came back for a coat. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. All I wanted was my old wool coat, the gray one with the worn elbows, the one that smelled like cedar and memories. The Pacific Northwest drizzle had started just after dawn, a cold, persistent mist that clung to everything and chilled you to the bone. I had parked my old sedan down the road, out of sight. I didn't want a confrontation. I just wanted my coat and the last shred of my dignity. The familiar crunch of gravel under my sensible shoes was the only sound besides the rhythmic drumming of rain on the porch roof of the house I no longer called my own. A car door slammed shut from the driveway, a jarringly expensive sound in the morning quiet. I turned, and there she was, Sabrina. But not the Sabrina I knew. The poised, sharp-suited negotiator who had coolly presented me with my eviction papers was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like a drowned rat. Her blonde hair was plastered to her skull. Her expensive silk blouse was translucent with rain, and her eyes were puffy and red. Her phone buzzed violently in her trembling hand, a relentless, angry vibration. Even from the porch steps, I could see the screen light up with a single name: Aurelius Council. The sight of it made her flinch. She saw me and stumbled forward, blocking my path to the door. "Mom," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper that was almost lost in the sound of the rain. "Mom, please." I stood perfectly still. The humiliation of 5 days ago was a block of ice in my chest. It didn't melt with pity. It sharpened into a cold, hard clarity. I looked at her not as family, but as a stranger, a puzzle to be solved. "I just came for my coat, Sabrina," I said, my own voice unnervingly calm. "No, listen," she begged, taking another step closer. The expensive phone buzzed again, a frantic pulse against her palm. "You don't understand. They're going to kill Nolan. They're going to kill him." She shoved a thick manila envelope into my hands. It was damp, the corners already softening. Then she did something I never thought I would see. Sabrina Vale, the conqueror, the winner, sank to her knees on the wet wooden planks of the porch my husband had built with his own 2 hands. "Just sign it," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a broken mess. "Just sign a confirmation that you left voluntarily, that the quitclaim was your idea. Please, Mom, I'm begging you. Help me." My gaze dropped to the envelope. Through a clear plastic window, I could see the letterhead of an escrow company. A single fat raindrop landed on the paper, right over the logo, making the ink bleed. In bold, stark letters below it, I could read 2 words: "Final notice." This was the woman who had won. The woman who had taken my home, my son, my future. And here she was, 5 days later, shattered and pleading at my feet. The victor had become the victim. The winner was begging the loser for help. The woman who held all the cards was folding. The only question was, why? 5 days before she knelt in the rain, Sabrina was a queen on her throne, and my cozy living room was her courtroom. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes into a private galaxy. The air smelled of what I thought was the scent of my life: old wood, aging paper from my husband's book collection, and the faint, sweet perfume of the last roses from the garden. I was in my favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on my lap. It was a perfectly ordinary Thursday. And then they arrived. Nolan, my only son, shuffled in first, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. Sabrina followed, closing the door with a soft, definitive click that seemed to seal the room off from the rest of the world. She was immaculate in a cream-colored pantsuit, the kind of armor a warrior wears into a boardroom. She sat on the sofa opposite me, Nolan sinking down beside her like a puppet with its strings cut. His hands were never still, pleating the hem of his polo shirt into a mess of wrinkles. "Mom," Sabrina began, her voice smooth as polished glass. She placed a sleek leather portfolio on the coffee table between us. "Nolan and I are so excited. We wanted to talk to you about an incredible opportunity. We're thinking of it as a family asset restructuring plan. The corporate jargon felt alien in that room, a language from a different planet. I looked at Nolan, hoping for a translation, for a simple, human explanation. He just stared at his own hands, his face pale. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, my voice steady. "Restructuring what exactly?" Sabrina's smile was bright, white, and completely devoid of warmth. "This house, this land, it's an incredible asset, but it's dormant. We've been approached with an offer, a life-changing offer that will secure Nolan's future, our future." She opened the portfolio. Inside were documents filled with clauses and numbers, but she slid a single page to the top. The heading was simple: Waiver of Life Estate. And my heart, which had been beating at its steady, 74-year-old rhythm, gave a painful lurch. My husband, Robert, had been a meticulous man. He had structured his will to ensure I could live in our home until the day I died. It was my right, my sanctuary. It wasn't an asset. It was my life. "The offer is for $22 million, Mom," Sabrina said, leaning forward as if sharing a wonderful secret. "All we need is for you to sign this waiver, and we can move forward. We've already found a wonderful state-of-the-art retirement community for you just outside the city. It has a pool." I looked from her beaming, predatory face to my son's bowed head. He was 42 years old, a grown man, and he couldn't even look me in the eye. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of my old life. "The answer is no," I said quietly. Sabrina's professional smile didn't just disappear, it was erased, leaving behind something hard and flat. Her eyes narrowed. "I don't think you heard me. This is $22 million. "I heard you perfectly," I replied, folding my hands over my crossword. "This is my home. Robert left it to me. I'm not leaving." "You don't understand what's at stake here," she hissed, her voice losing its polished edge. "This isn't just some deal. This is everything. This is for Nolan." She shot a sharp, angry look at her husband, a general reprimanding a cowardly soldier. Her phone, lying face down on the coffee table, vibrated with a low hum. It was a quick, single buzz. As she reached for it, her movements were so sharp and angry that she knocked it, flipping its screen up for a fraction of a second. It was just a glimpse, a flash of white on black from a message preview, but I saw it. I caught 2 letters before she swiped it away. JC. The sight of those initials seemed to solidify her resolve. She stood up, her face set like stone. "Fine. If you won't be reasonable, then we'll do this the hard way." She walked to the hall closet and pulled out the old, battered suitcase I kept for weekend trips. She must have packed it earlier, when I was out buying groceries. The violation of it, the premeditated cruelty, hit me harder than the financial figures. She dragged it back into the living room and dropped it at my feet. The latch popped open. A small, silk scarf I'd knitted myself spilled out, carrying the faint, sharp scent of the medicated oil I use for my arthritis. A small, intimate part of my life, now part of my public eviction. "Nolan needs this," Sabrina said, her voice cold and final. "His needs come before your sentimentality." I turned my gaze to my son. "Nolan?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Look at me." He wouldn't. He couldn't. He just stood there, a statue carved from shame, his eyes fixed on a meaningless spot on the hardwood floor. His silence was his signature on the document. His refusal to look at me was his betrayal. It wasn't Sabrina who was breaking my heart. It was the son I had raised, the boy I had taught to be a good man, who was now standing by and letting this happen. I stood up, my old bones aching with a pain that had nothing to do with age. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my purse, zipped the suitcase, and walked towards the door. Sabrina stepped aside with a triumphant smirk. As I opened the door, I paused and looked back at my son one last time. He finally looked up, and in his eyes, I saw not malice, but a terrifying weakness. He was a man drowning, and he was pulling me under to save himself. The only sound in the universe was the cheap plastic wheels of my suitcase bumping down the 3 wooden steps of the porch my husband had built. Thump, thump, thump. A final, hollow heartbeat, signaling the end of a life. The place Sabrina had sent me to was called the Starlight Motel. The name was a cruel joke. The only star in sight was the one on the sign, and it was missing 2 of its 5 points. The rest of the sign flickered a sick, greenish light that pulsed against the room's thin curtains, painting the walls in rhythm with its dying breath. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, a sterile sadness that clung to the cheap polyester bedspread. This was my new home. A 10 by 12-foot box on the edge of town, paid for with a wad of cash from my own daughter-in-law. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest. The manila envelope she had shoved into my hand during my humiliating exit lay on the nightstand. It felt heavy, not with documents, but with the weight of the transaction it represented. My life, bartered away for a quiet departure. For a long while, I just stared at it, a final piece of evidence from the crime scene of my own life. Finally, my hands moved. The paper was thick and impersonal. Inside, there was no note, no letter of explanation, just cash, 4 crisp $50 bills, $200, an insultingly small price for a lifetime of memories. It was enough for a few nights in this purgatory, enough to keep me out of their hair while the ink dried on their new future. Beneath the money was a single folded document. My fingers felt numb as I unfolded it. It was a copy of the Waiver of Life Estate, a quitclaim deed, and there, at the bottom, above the typed name, Iris Pennington, was a signature. My signature. The air rushed out of my lungs. For a second, the flickering green light outside seemed to swallow all the oxygen in the room. I saw the familiar loops, the precise way the I connected to the R, the sharp, definitive cross of the T. It was mine. But I had never seen this paper before in my life. I had never held the pen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossibility. Had I signed something without realizing? In my grief after Robert's passing, had I been careless? I was a legal secretary for 40 years. I read everything, even the fine print on a cereal box. I would never have signed away my home. I brought the paper closer, my eyes tracing the lines of my own name. The shape was right. The form was perfect. It was a flawless replica of my signature from 3 years ago. 3 years, 2 months, and 1 week ago, to be precise. That was the day I slipped on a patch of black ice in the driveway and shattered my right wrist. The surgery that followed was complex, involving a plate and 6 pins. The recovery was a long, arduous journey of physical therapy, of coaxing my fingers to bend again, of learning to hold a pen without a tremor of pain. The accident had changed me, and it had changed my handwriting. My new signature was different. It was still mine, but it carried the ghost of the injury. The loops were a little wider, the pressure less certain. The final N in Pennington always had a slight, telltale waver, a tiny imperfection that only I and my banker and my doctor would ever recognize. The signature on this paper was bold, confident, and steady. It was the signature of a woman with 2 good wrists. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, cold and sharp. They hadn't just tricked me, they had forged my name. And then came the second, more devastating realization. Where did they get it? Where would Sabrina find a perfect, isolated copy of my old signature to scan and reproduce? The answer coiled in my gut like a snake. Nolan. Years ago, my son had needed a co-signer for his first business loan, a disastrous venture that ended in bankruptcy. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with him, signing the bank documents Robert had prepared. I had signed a dozen pages that day. Nolan must have kept one. He must have held onto an old piece of his father's paperwork, a document bearing my pristine pre-injury signature, and he had given it to his wife. This wasn't a spontaneous act of weak-willed compliance in the living room. This was premeditated, calculated. They had planned this for weeks, maybe months. Nolan hadn't just been a silent accomplice. He had been the architect of the fraud. He had handed Sabrina the key and the weapon she needed to steal my entire life from me. The shock that had frozen my heart began to thaw, but what replaced it wasn't grief. It was rage, a cold, quiet, and utterly clear fury. It didn't make me want to scream or break things. It settled deep in my bones, hardening my spine into a column of steel. It was the kind of anger that doesn't cloud your judgment. It hones it to a razor's edge. I looked at the signature again, but this time with the secretary's eye, not a mother's. The ink was too perfect. The lines were too uniform in weight and color. There were none of the microscopic variations in pressure that come from a real pen on real paper. It looked flat, lifeless. It was the sterile perfection of a digital copy, traced and printed. A high-tech lie. They thought they were clever. They thought they had covered all their bases. They had pushed an old woman out of her house and into a cheap motel, expecting her to fade away quietly with her $200. They had underestimated me. They saw a grieving widow. They had forgotten the legal secretary who knew that the devil and justice is always in the details. The green light outside flickered, and in that moment, I wasn't in the dark. For the first time in 5 days, I could see the path forward with perfect, chilling clarity. This was no longer just about a house. This was about a crime, and I was going to be the one to expose it. The next morning, I checked out of the Starlight Motel, leaving the $200 on the nightstand. It was blood money, and I didn't want it. Clutching the forged document in my purse, I drove to the one place in the world where I knew order reigned over chaos, the law offices of Ortega and Associates. Maylin Ortega and I went back 30 years. I was the head legal secretary at the firm where she was a bright-eyed, razor-sharp rookie. I taught her how to organize a trial binder that could stop a bullet. She taught me that the law wasn't just a set of rules, but a weapon. Now, she was a named partner with a corner office overlooking the city, a space that smelled of expensive leather, strong coffee, and total competence. She greeted me with a firm hug, her expression a mixture of concern and a barely concealed readiness for a fight. "Iris," she said, her voice crisp. "You look like you've been through the ringer. Talk to me." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I sat down in one of her plush client chairs and laid the counterfeit quitclaim deed on the acres of polished mahogany between us. "They forged my signature, Maylin," I said, my voice flat. "Sabrina and Nolan. They threw me out and used this to do it." Maylin's face hardened. She picked up the document not like a piece of paper, but like a piece of evidence. She slipped on a pair of sleek, black-rimmed reading glasses and clicked on a powerful desk lamp, angling the light directly onto the page. For a full minute, she was silent, her dark eyes scanning every line, every letter, every space. The only sound was the faint hum of the lamp. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile I'd seen her give opposing counsel right before she tore their entire case to shreds in a deposition. It was the smile of a shark that had just caught the scent of blood in the water. "Oh, Iris," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "They didn't just make a mistake. They've gift-wrapped their own prosecution and handed it to us on a silver platter." She took a silver pen from a holder on her desk and used the tip as a pointer. "Flaw number 1, and it's the big one. Your life estate. Robert had this thing drafted by the best estate lawyer in the state. It's ironclad. Legally, you have more right to be in that house than Nolan does. Trying to break a life estate like this is like trying to punch your way through a brick wall. They knew they couldn't do it legally, so they resorted to this." She tapped the forged signature. "That's not even the best part," she continued, her eyes gleaming behind her glasses. "Flaw number 2. This signature. You told me about your wrist surgery. This signature is a joke. It's too clean, too perfect. A competent document examiner would shred this in about 5 seconds. They were playing for keeps, but they did it with amateur-hour tools." She leaned closer to the document, her smile widening. "But this is my favorite part. Flaw number 3. Her pen tapped on the notary public's seal at the bottom of the page, a faint, embossed circle with a purple ink stamp over it. "See this ink?" she asked. The official Washington State notary stamp uses a specific, oil-based, slow-drying ink to prevent smudging and prove authenticity. "This," she said, tapping the purple mark, "is a water-based, quick-dry ink. The kind you find in a cheap self-inking stamp you can buy online for $20. They were in such a hurry to file the deed and close their deal that they faked the notary stamp with the wrong equipment." She leaned back in her chair, looking utterly delighted. "They got greedy, and they got sloppy. It's a fatal combination." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. The cold, hard knot of rage in my stomach didn't disappear, but it was joined by something new, hope. A fierce, burning hope. So what do? I asked. Do we file a police report? Sue them? Mei Lin held up a hand. Number, we do something much better. We do nothing. I stared at her. Nothing? Precisely. Let them think they've won. Let them pop the champagne and celebrate. Right now, this fraudulent deed is with the title insurance company for the buyers, Aurelius Capital. Those companies are meticulous, paranoid bulldogs. It's their job to find any and all clouds on a property's title. They have 5 business days to complete their due diligence review before the sale can close and the money is released. She looked me straight in the eye, her expression deadly serious. They will find this: the forged signature, the bogus notary stamp, and the indestructible life estate you still hold. We're not going to spring the trap, Iris. We're going to let them walk right into it. The title company will do our dirty work for us. And when they refuse to insure the title, Sabrina's $22 million deal will implode. She stood up and walked over to a towering bookshelf filled with law books. She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume and opened it on her desk, turning a few pages before running her finger down a specific section. And when it does, she said, her voice dropping to a low, determined pitch, we'll be waiting. Washington State Statute 4.2.4.230. She looked up at me, the shark smile back in full force. Provides for triple damages in cases of financial fraud committed against a vulnerable person. And Iris, the law considers anyone over 65 to be a vulnerable person. For the first time since my son stood by and watched his wife throw me out of my home, I felt a flicker of my old self return. The pain was being replaced by strategy. The grief was being forged into a weapon. They thought I was a fragile old woman. They were about to find out I was anything but. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Mei Lin's advice was to wait, but I've never been good at sitting still. While the title company's gears were slowly grinding, I decided it was time to follow the oldest piece of advice in the book: follow the money. And for that, there was only one person to call. Selma Coe wasn't a lawyer or a private investigator. She was a forensic accountant, which is a polite way of saying she was a bloodhound for numbers. She could sniff out a hidden asset or a bogus balance sheet from a mile away. We met at a noisy little cafe downtown, the air thick with the smell of roasting coffee beans and the hiss of an espresso machine. The setting was a world away from the sterile danger we were about to discuss. Selma was a small, neat woman in her late 50s with eyes that missed nothing. She didn't bother with a laptop. Her tools were a fountain pen and a crisp, white legal pad. She was already sipping a black coffee when I arrived. Iris, she said, her voice low and direct. Mei Lin gave me the broad strokes. Tell me everything. I laid it all out. The sudden appearance of Sabrina and Nolan, the offer of $22 million from a company called Aurelius Capital, the forged quitclaim, my eviction. I told her everything I knew, which felt like precious little. She listened without interruption, her pen occasionally making a small, sharp note on her pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on some distant point beyond my shoulder. 22 million, she said, more to herself than to me. That number, it's too round, too clean. Deals like this always have contingencies, fees, odd numbers. This feels less like a valuation, and more like a solution. A number big enough to make people do stupid things. She took a long sip of her coffee. This doesn't pass the smell test, Iris. From a folder, she pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it, she had already drawn a simple flowchart, a series of boxes and names connected by sharp, black lines. It was her initial sketch of the financial battlefield. Okay, she said, uncapping her pen. Let's start with the money itself. Sabrina told you Aurelius Capital is paying $22 million for the property. That's a lie. I must have looked confused, because she tapped the central box on her diagram. This isn't a straightforward cash purchase. The money isn't coming from Aurelius's main coffers. It's a bridge financing loan, issued by something called an SPV, a special purpose vehicle that Aurelius created specifically for this deal. In English, Selma? I asked. An SPV is a shell company, a legal cardboard box they create to hold all the risk for a single, high-stakes deal. And bridge financing? Think of it as a short, expensive leash. It's a temporary loan to make a deal happen fast, with brutally high interest rates and punishing terms. It's not a prize, Iris. It's a cage. She drew a thick, red line from the box labeled Aurelius SPV to a new box she drew and labeled Sabrina divided by Nolan. And here is the most important part, she said, her voice dropping. I had a friend pull the term sheet for this specific loan. It's built like a house of cards. The entire $22 million disbursement is contingent on one single, non-negotiable clause. She looked me dead in the eye. The property must be delivered free of any and all liens, encumbrances, or existing claims of residence. The hiss of the espresso machine seemed to fade into the background. My life estate, I whispered. Exactly, Selma said, a grim look on her face. Your life estate isn't just a nuisance to them. It's a deal killer. As long as you have the legal right to step foot on that property, Iris, not one single penny of that loan will be released. The money is frozen. That's why they were in such a hurry. That's why their forgery was so sloppy. They're on a clock, and your very existence is running it out. Suddenly, the whole picture shifted. Sabrina's desperation wasn't just about greed. She was trapped. She had signed on for this massive loan, promised to deliver my home, and now the entire structure was about to collapse on top of her because of me. So who's holding the leash? I asked. Selma's pen moved to a name she had already written in a box at the very top of the page, a name connected by a direct line to the Aurelius SPV. She circled it twice in red ink. Julian Croft, she said. His title is Vice President of Risk Mitigation. Don't let the bland title fool you. This guy isn't some pencil pusher. He's the guy they send in when things get messy. His job is to make problems disappear. Quietly, efficiently. He's not a lawyer, Iris. He's a scalpel. JC, the initials from the text message on Sabrina's phone. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. Selma turned the pad around so I could see the full picture. It wasn't just a flowchart anymore. It was a map of my new reality. At the top was the shadowy corporate entity, Aurelius Capital, with Julian Croft as its enforcer. In the middle was the $22 million loan, a ticking time bomb. And at the bottom, skewered by a thick red arrow, was my family, Sabrina and Nolan. They weren't the predators I thought they were just the bait. This wasn't a simple family betrayal anymore. This wasn't a con. I had stumbled into a war with a monster I couldn't even see. And my home, my life, was the battlefield. The game had changed, and the stakes were infinitely higher than I ever could have imagined. With the clock ticking on the title company's review, I found myself adrift. I had a strategy, thanks to Mei Lin, and a map of the enemy's finances, thanks to Selma. But I was missing the why. Why this piece of land? $22 million was a staggering sum, far more than a simple 12-acre plot with a craftsman house should command, even with a lake view. There had to be something more, a hidden value I couldn't see. To clear my head, I drove back to the house. I let myself in with the spare key Sabrina and Nolan had forgotten about, a small oversight that felt like a tiny victory. The house was cold and silent, already feeling less like a home and more like a stage waiting for new actors. The living room, the site of my eviction, felt tainted. I couldn't stay there. I found myself drawn, as I often was when I was troubled, to my husband's study. Robert's study was his sanctuary, and after he passed, it became a sort of time capsule. I had never had the heart to change a thing. A fine layer of dust covered everything, a silver film over a paused life. The air held the scent of aging paper, leather, and the faint, lingering smell of his pipe tobacco. It was the scent of him. I wasn't looking for anything specific. It was a long shot, but I needed to feel connected to his quiet strength, his meticulous mind. I ran my fingers along the spines of his geology textbooks and local history tomes. He had been an engineer, but his passion was the earth beneath our feet. He loved this land, not just for its beauty, but for its story, written in layers of rock and soil. I started going through the drawers of his large oak desk, sifting through old blueprints and property surveys. Then I moved to the filing cabinet in the corner. The top drawer was labeled Alder Lake Property. Inside were neatly organized files: the original deed, property tax records, building permits for the porch. And then I saw it, a large rolled-up tube tied with a faded red ribbon. I recognized it instantly. It was the detailed groundwater map of our property and the surrounding area. "So this is it," I whispered to the empty room. "This is what they're after." I untied the ribbon and spread the map across the desk. It was a beautiful, complex web of blue lines indicating subterranean water flows, aquifers, and natural springs. This had to be the key to the land's inflated value. Maybe they'd found a way to tap into it, to sell the water rights. As I rolled the map back up, my fingers brushed against something stiff behind the other files in the back of the drawer. It was thick, heavy. I pulled it out. It was a canvas-bound folio, the kind used for formal reports, its dark green cover faded with age. There was no title on the front, just a small, typed label on the spine: Valley Aquifer Salinity Study, U.S. Geological Survey, 1988. Curiosity piqued, I opened it. It was dense, filled with technical charts, chemical tables, and geological jargon that went straight over my head. It seemed like a dry academic report. But then I saw my husband's handwriting. His familiar, meticulous script, written in the margins with a fountain pen, was everywhere. He had been studying this document, arguing with it, adding his own calculations. And then I found the page he had bookmarked. A section on the aquifer's delicate balance, its vulnerability to saltwater intrusion from the nearby sound. In the margin, Robert had underlined a sentence and written a single, chilling note. His handwriting was firm, urgent. Note: extensive excavation or deep foundation construction on the Alder Lake plot will compromise the clay lens. This will trigger irreversible saline contamination of the primary freshwater aquifer, poisoning the entire valley's water supply within 18 months. This land is the valley's guardian. The air left my lungs. I read the sentence again and again. The whole world tilted on its axis. They weren't planning to use the water. They were going to destroy it. A luxury resort, a housing development, whatever Aurelius Capital planned to build here, would be a poison pill for the entire community. And Robert had known. He hadn't bought this land as an investment. He had bought it as a shield. He had been playing the long game, quietly acting as the protector for a town that never even knew it was in danger. This was his true legacy. The first tear fell, hot and surprising, landing on the back of my hand. It was followed by another and another. They weren't tears of grief for the man I had lost, but of profound understanding for the man I now realized I had been married to. The quiet engineer who loved books and rocks had been a silent hero. Tucked inside the back cover of the folio was one last thing: a handwritten letter, folded in 4. The envelope simply said, "For Iris." My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Iris," it began. "If you are reading this, it means someone has come for our land, and I am not there to stop them. Do not be afraid. You are stronger than you know. I have taken precautions. The deed is protected, as are you. I've instructed my lawyer to include a provision in my trust, a springing trust that will activate under specific conditions of duress. He will know what to do. This land is more than just our home. It is a promise I made to our neighbors, seen and unseen. Now, I must ask you to be its keeper. Your loving husband, Robert." The fight was no longer about my house. It was no longer about my pride or my betrayal or even the $22 million. This was about a promise, a sacred duty passed from my husband to me. This battle now had a name. It was called Robert's Legacy, and I would not let it fall. By Friday evening, the 4th day of my exile, the waiting was beginning to fray my nerves. Maylin's plan was sound, but it required a patience I was struggling to maintain. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. That evening, some strange, self-destructive impulse drew me back. I didn't park down the road this time. I parked in the designated visitor's spot for the public boat launch a quarter-mile away and walked through the woods, the familiar path soft with pine needles under my feet. As I neared the edge of my property, a sound I hadn't heard in years reached me: the the dull, rhythmic thump of a bass line. And then I saw the lights. My backyard, the place where Robert and I had hosted quiet barbecues and watched meteor showers, had been transformed. Strings of fairy lights, like swarms of fake stars, were draped between the old cedar trees. A bar had been set up on the lawn, tended by a man in a crisp white jacket. People, dozens of them, all strangers dressed in sharp, expensive clothes, milled about on the stone patio, holding glasses of champagne. The air, which should have smelled like lake water and night-blooming jasmine, was thick with competing perfumes and the synthetic cheer of a catered affair. They were throwing a party, a victory party, a cold, hard fury, purer than anything I had felt before, settled in my chest. I slipped behind the old boathouse at the edge of the lawn, the shadows hiding me completely. From there, I had a perfect, unobstructed view, and there was Sabrina, the queen of the ball. She wore a shimmering silver dress that caught the light, and her laughter, a little too loud and a little too bright, rang out across the lawn. She moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a conqueror, a champagne flute held aloft like a scepter. She was holding court, accepting congratulations from men in tailored suits and women with surgically perfected smiles. This wasn't a gathering of friends, this was a corporate celebration. She was showing off her prize. I watched Nolan trailing in her wake, looking lost and uncomfortable in a blazer that seemed a size too big for his diminished spirit. He would nod and force a smile when spoken to, but his eyes were constantly scanning the crowd, as if looking for an escape route. He was a ghost at his own feast. For half an hour, I watched this spectacle, this violation of my home. I saw Sabrina point to the spot where Robert's prize-winning roses used to be, now just a patch of bare earth, and laugh as she described some new landscaping plan. Each laugh, each toast, was like a small, sharp stone being thrown at me. And then, a man arrived. He wasn't loud or flashy. He entered from the side of the house, moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that made him stand out more than any of the boisterous guests. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and wore a perfectly cut dark suit. He didn't stride, he materialized. The party's center of gravity seemed to shift toward him. People made way for him without seeming to realize they were doing it. It was Julian Croft. He surveyed the scene with a placid, unreadable expression, his eyes taking in everything. He looked less like a guest and more like an inspector. Sabrina, in the middle of a triumphant story, saw him. Her brilliant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she plastered it back on. She excused herself and glided over to him. "Julian, I'm so glad you could make it," I could hear her say, her voice straining to sound casual. He didn't smile back. He just nodded and said something too low for me to hear. He gestured slightly with his head, and the two of them moved to a more secluded spot near the edge of the patio, away from the chatter. From my hiding place, I watched them, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. The moment the trap was sprung, Croft spoke first. He was calm, his posture relaxed, his hands in his pockets. He looked like he was discussing the weather. Sabrina listened, nodding, her confident smile still in place. But as he continued to speak, I saw the change. It was like watching a beautiful ice sculpture crack in slow motion. The smile didn't just fade. It froze on her face, a grotesque mask of joy. The color drained from her cheeks. Her body went rigid, her shoulders tensing under the shimmering fabric of her dress. He must have delivered the final blow, the two fatal words I knew he was saying. Life estate. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It didn't just fall. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before hitting the stone patio. The sound, a single, sharp, crystalline shatter, sliced through the music and the laughter like a razor. A ripple of silence spread out from them. Heads turned. The party, for a beat, stopped dead. Sabrina just stood there, staring at him, her face a canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. Her $22 million house of cards had just collapsed. The other shoe had just dropped, and it had landed right on her throat. And in the shadows of the boathouse, I stood and watched the wreckage. There was no joy in it, only a cold, bitter, and profound satisfaction. The satisfaction of a chess player watching her opponent finally see the checkmate that's been on the board for 3 moves. The party was over. We were back in the present. The rain hadn't let up, forming a gray, weeping curtain around the porch. Sabrina was still a sodden, broken heap at my feet, her desperate eyes fixed on my face, waiting for me to grant her salvation. The woman who had orchestrated my downfall was now begging me to rewrite her ending. For a moment, I just watched the rain drip from the tips of her expensive, ruined hair. The shoe was well and truly on the other foot, but I wasn't going to offer a simple pardon. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about justice and control. Ignoring her pleading gaze, I took my phone out of my coat pocket. My movements were slow, deliberate. I found Maylin's number in my contacts and pressed the call button. Then, I pressed the speakerphone icon. The electronic chirp cut through the sound of the rain. Sabrina flinched, her eyes widening as she realized what I was doing. She was no longer just a supplicant. She was now a captive audience in a legal proceeding. The phone rang twice. Maylin Ortega. Her voice came through the speaker, crisp and professional, with no hint of the early hour. "Maylin, it's Iris," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I have Sabrina here with me. She's had a change of heart regarding the quitclaim deed. It seems she requires my signature on a document confirming my departure was voluntary." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Maylin's mind processing the new development, seeing the entire chessboard rearrange itself. When she spoke again, her voice had a new, sharp edge. "I see. And is Mrs. Pennington willing to provide this signature?" "Mrs. Pennington," I said, looking directly down into Sabrina's terrified eyes, "is willing to sign, with a few conditions." Sabrina's head shot up. This wasn't the simple transaction she had hoped for. "I'm listening," Maylin said. I didn't have to look at a list. I had spent the last 4 days engraving these terms onto my soul. "First," I began, my voice clear and unwavering, "a full, written and notarized confession from both Sabrina and my son, Nolan. It will detail the conspiracy to commit fraud, the forging of my signature, and the coercion used to remove me from my home." Sabrina let out a small, strangled gasp. "Second," I continued, "Sabrina will cede all financial power of attorney for Nolan's affairs to a third-party trustee of my choosing, for a period of no less than 5 years. Third, they will both sign a public declaration, to be filed with the county and provided to Aurelius Capital, permanently and irrevocably relinquishing any and all current or future claims to the Alder Lake property." Sabrina was openly weeping now, shaking her head in disbelief. This wasn't a rescue. It was a surrender. "And finally," I said, delivering the killing blow, upon the dissolution of their deal with Aurelius, a payment of $1.5 million will be made from their accounts to establish the Pennington Fund for Elder Legal Defense, to help others they might see as easy targets. The line was silent for a moment. Then, Maylin's voice, filled with a cold professional satisfaction, came back. "The terms are noted. Iris, shall I begin drafting the documents?" "Yes," I said. "Thank you, Maylin." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked down at my daughter-in-law. Her face was a wreck of tear-streaked makeup and dawning horror. She was trading a quick death from Julian Croft for a long, slow, public annihilation at my hands. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She knew she was cornered. She had thrown herself on my mercy, only to find I had none left to give. Finally, in a gesture of total defeat, she gave a single, jerky nod. I held all the cards. The game was over. I had won. And then my phone rang again. The sudden, cheerful ringtone felt like a sacrilege in the tense silence. I pulled it out, annoyed at the interruption. The screen read, "Joan Marwick, my next-door neighbor." I almost ignored it, but a lifetime of habit made me answer. "Joan?" "Iris." "Oh, thank God you answered." Her voice was a breathless, excited rush. Joan was a retired investigative reporter, and she still buzzed with the thrill of the chase. "You are not going to believe this. I've been doing some digging for my book, calling up some old contacts about Aurelius Capital, just fishing for background." A cold dread, slick and immediate, began to creep up my spine. "Joan, what did you do?" "I hit the jackpot," she said, completely oblivious to the sudden ice in my voice. "I was talking to a source, an old friend over at the Financial Times. I can't say much, of course. It was all off the record, but I hinted that there might be some internal trouble with their big Alder Lake acquisition. You know, a snag with the title, a disgruntled family member, that sort of thing. And he bit. He's going to start making calls. We might have a real story here, Iris. A David and Goliath thing. The world seemed to tilt. The sound of the rain, the sight of Sabrina's broken form, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. Maylin's entire strategy, our perfect, silent trap, hinged on one thing: surprise. It hinged on Aurelius and Croft believing this was a minor bureaucratic snag that would be discovered internally by the title company. Joan, in her hungry pursuit of a story, had just bypassed the trap entirely. She had picked up a megaphone and announced to a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that someone was actively leaking information about their deal to the press. She hadn't just warned them, she had put them on war footing. I looked at Sabrina. Her head was tilted, her tear-filled eyes now sharp with a new, complex light. She had heard every word. The absolute despair on her face was being replaced by something else, a flicker of chaos, a new variable. The chess match I had so carefully controlled was over. My well-meaning, ambitious friend had just kicked the board over, sending all the pieces flying. And now, a far more dangerous player knew I was coming. Joan's phone call had changed the weather. The fog of uncertainty had been burned away, replaced by the harsh, clear light of imminent confrontation. I didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, a black town car, so sleek and out of place it looked like a panther in a petting zoo, glided to a stop at the end of my driveway. Julian Croft didn't come alone. He was flanked by two lawyers, a man and a woman, both young, sharp, and radiating an aggressive, expensive competence. They carried identical leather briefcases like soldiers carrying their rifles. I met them at the door and led them into the living room. My living room. The same room where my son's betrayal had unfolded. Now it was a boardroom. The air, which should have smelled of lemon polish and old books, was thick with tension and the faint metallic scent of a high-stakes negotiation. There was no pretense of a social call. This was an invasion. Croft sat on the sofa where Sabrina had sat, his posture relaxed, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His lawyers took up positions in the armchairs, opening their briefcases in perfect sync. They didn't come to talk. They came to transact. "Mrs. Pennington," Croft began, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. It was the kind of voice that could talk you into anything, calm, reassuring, and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. "Thank you for seeing us. I'm here to cut through the noise and propose a quick, clean solution for everyone involved." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "It has come to our attention that there may be some confusion regarding the title transfer. These things happen. Clerical errors, miscommunications. They can lead to messy, protracted, and very public legal battles. Nobody wants that. It's bad for business. It's stressful for families." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And it can bring a great deal of unwelcome scrutiny upon everyone involved, especially upon family members who may have made some regrettable choices. Men like your son, Nolan, for instance. A man in his position is quite vulnerable." It was a perfectly delivered threat, wrapped in the language of concern. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't said a single explicit thing. But the message was crystal clear. "Drop this, or we will destroy your son." I let the threat settle in the room. I didn't rise to the bait. I didn't defend Nolan. I didn't argue about the fraud or the forgery. Arguing with him on his terms was like wrestling a pig in the mud. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. I had to change the terrain entirely. I let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds. His calm expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, impatience, perhaps even surprise that I wasn't flustered. Then I stood up. Without a word, I walked to my husband's oak desk in the corner of the room. I picked up the heavy, canvas-bound folio, the U.S. Geological Survey report. I walked back to the coffee table and placed it down between us. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. The sound was small, but it felt like an earthquake in the quiet room. The two lawyers glanced at the report, then at each other, A silent, questioning exchange. Croft's eyes narrowed slightly, a predator trying to classify a new and unexpected creature in its territory. "This is no longer about a house, Mr. Croft," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the folio between us. "This isn't about a forged signature or a life estate anymore. You can have the house. In fact, you can have the whole 12 acres. Croft's expression was a perfect mask of polite confusion, but I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was off balance. I placed my hand on the cover of the report. "This is about the water," I said. "It's about the freshwater aquifer that supplies this entire valley. An aquifer that, according to this study, your construction plans will permanently destroy with saltwater contamination." I let that sink in. I looked from Croft to his lawyers, whose professional poise was beginning to crack. The woman was now staring at the report as if it were a bomb. I imagine a story like that, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, knowingly poisoning the water supply of an entire community to build a luxury resort, might be of some interest to certain parties, I continued, my voice gaining strength. The Environmental Protection Agency, for one. Perhaps the national news networks. I hear a David and Goliath story sells quite well these days. And there it was. The first crack in Julian Croft's perfect marble composure. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible. His gaze flickered from me, to the report, and then, for a fraction of a second, to his lead lawyer. It was a silent, panicked question. "Did you know about this?" The lawyer gave a nearly invisible shake of his head. The power in the room didn't just shift. It reversed its polarity completely. Croft's mask was back in place almost instantly, but the damage was done. I had seen behind it. He cleared his throat, and his hand went to his silk tie, a small, unconscious gesture to loosen a knot that had suddenly become too tight. He had walked into my home a shark, ready for a quick and brutal kill. He had expected a fight about money and property, a battle he knew how to win. But I hadn't brought a knife to a gunfight. I had brought a nuke. And he was standing at ground zero. After Julian Croft and his legal entourage departed, a heavy, unnatural silence descended upon the house. He hadn't accepted or rejected my terms. He had simply given a curt nod and left, leaving the threat of his power hanging in the air. But my focus was no longer on Croft. He was a shark, and sharks act according to their nature. I was thinking about my son, the man who had willingly chummed the waters. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The familiar ritual of making tea was a small anchor in a sea of chaos. I didn't know if he would come, but I felt he would. A man can only run so far from the wreckage he's created. As the kettle began its low, rumbling climb toward a boil, a key turned in the back door. Nolan slipped into the room like a shadow. The outline specified he should look like a ghost, and it was true. All the color was gone from his face, leaving a pale, drawn mask of exhaustion and fear. He looked older, smaller, as if the weight of his own weakness had physically compressed him. He didn't look at me, but instead stared at the scuffed linoleum of the kitchen floor, the same floor he'd raced his toy cars across as a boy. The kettle shrieked, and I poured the boiling water into 2 mugs. I placed one on the table in front of an empty chair. An invitation. He finally looked up, then shuffled to the table and sank into the seat. "She called me," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Sabrina. She told me what happened. About the party. About Croft. And she didn't tell you about her visit to me this morning?" I asked, my voice devoid of accusation. It was a simple, clinical question. He shook his head, his eyes welling up. "Number I. I've barely seen her. After Croft left the party, she locked herself in the bedroom. I think she's terrified." "She has good reason to be," I said simply, taking a sip of my tea. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. There would be no comforting words, no gentle absolutions. That was all it took. The dam broke, the confession spilled out of him, a torrent of shame and fear. He told me about the debt, a string of disastrous stock market bets made with borrowed money, a hole that had grown to over $600,000. He described the walls closing in, the threatening calls from creditors. Sabrina said this deal was the only way out. He choked out, tears now streaming down his face. She said it was a sure thing. Aurelius wanted the land, And Croft, he found out about my debt. He didn't even have to threaten me, Mom. He just laid out the facts. He said he could make my problems go away, or he could make them 1,000 times worse. And the signature? I asked, my voice still level. Whose idea was that? He flinched, the question hitting him like a physical blow. Mine, he whispered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. She was panicking because you wouldn't sign. I remembered Dad's old files. I knew your signature was on some of them. I got it for her. I told myself it was to save us, to save her, but it was cowardly. I know it was. He then told me the most pathetic part of the story. 2 nights ago, in a fit of alcohol-fueled guilt and a desperate, foolish attempt to be a hero, he had gone to see Croft himself. He'd had a tiny recording device in his pocket, thinking he could trick Croft into saying something incriminating, something to get leverage and protect Sabrina. He knew, Nolan said, a bitter, broken laugh escaping his lips. He must have known the second I walked in. He let me talk, let me make my stupid, clumsy threats. Then he just smiled, told me to check my coat pocket. The recorder was gone. He held it up and told me that if I ever tried a stunt like that again, Sabrina wouldn't have to worry about the deal falling through, because she'd be a widow. He buried his face in his hands. He played me for a fool and then broke me in half. I listened to it all, every last sordid detail. When he was finished, a shuddering, spent wreck, he looked up at me, his eyes pleading for something: forgiveness, comfort, a way out. I offered him none of it. Instead, I reached for a piece of paper I had set on the counter earlier. It was a simple 1-page document I had typed myself. I slid it across the table to him, along with a pen. He looked at it, confused. What's this? It's your future, I said, my voice now hard as iron. It's a commitment. You will sell your car by the end of the month. You will get a job, any job, I don't care if it's flipping burgers, within 2 weeks. You will enroll in debt counseling and provide me with weekly progress reports, and you will pack a bag and move out. You have 6 months to get your own place and prove you can stand on your own 2 feet as a man. He stared at the page, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief. Mum, I am not going to comfort you, I said, cutting him off. I am not going to tell you it's okay. It's not. You broke the law, you betrayed your father's memory, and you betrayed me. I'm not here to save you from your guilt, Nolan. I'm giving you a chance to earn back your own dignity. He read the simple, brutal terms on the page. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. He looked from the document to my unyielding face, and his expression began to change. The fear was still there, but something else was dawning in his eyes. He began to cry again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the sobbing of a scared child. It was the quiet, shuddering tears of a man who had been completely lost and had just been handed a map. The road it pointed to was grueling, steep, and paved with humility, but it was a road. It was a way out. With a trembling hand, he picked up the pen. He uncapped it, and with a single, decisive stroke, he signed his name on the line at the bottom. The first honest signature he'd given in a very long time. The county clerk's office was a temple of impersonality. It was a cavern of beige walls, polished linoleum floors that squeaked under your shoes, and the flat, sterile hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It smelled of old paper and bureaucratic indifference. It was the last place on earth you'd expect a soul to be saved or sold. Yet here we were, about to witness both. I sat on a hard wooden bench alongside Mei Lin. Across a wide, empty table sat Sabrina. If she was a ghost in my kitchen, she was a specter here. Her face was pale and devoid of all expression, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. She wore a simple gray dress, a stark contrast to the power suits and shimmering party dresses that had been her armor. She looked like she was attending her own funeral. A quiet, balding notary public entered the room, pushing a small cart laden with stacks of documents and his official seal. He didn't look at any of us. He was a functionary, a human cog in the machine of law. Mei Lin, ever in command, began laying out the documents in a neat, precise row. She was a surgeon laying out her instruments before a critical operation. There was the confession, its pages filled with the humiliating details of their conspiracy. There was the power of attorney agreement, formally stripping her of control over Nolan's finances. There was the irrevocable relinquishment of all claims to my property. And finally, there was the wire transfer authorization for $1.5 million, the seed money for the Pennington Fund. It was the complete and total dismantling of her life, codified in 12-point Times New Roman. Aurelius Capital, as it turned out, had no stomach for a public environmental scandal. Faced with the threat of front-page headlines and EPA investigations, Croft had quickly gotten cold feet. A quiet, amended agreement had been reached. They would proceed with a severely scaled-back development plan on a different, less sensitive parcel of land they owned down the coast, and they would walk away from my property entirely. They cut their losses. And as part of that deal, Sabrina's $22 million payday, the loan that had started this whole nightmare, had evaporated into thin air. She was left with nothing but the consequences. "Sabrina," Maylin said, her voice calm and even, "please review each document. If you agree to the terms, sign and date where indicated." Sabrina moved as if in a trance. She didn't read a single word. She knew what was in those papers. She had been living with their shadow for days. She picked up the pen, its click echoing in the silent room. One by one, she moved down the line, her signature a lifeless scrawl on each page, a stark contrast to the bold, confident forgery that had begun this war. When she reached the last page, the wire transfer, she signed it and then paused. With the documents squared up in a neat pile, she slid them back across the table toward Maylin. Her movements were fluid, almost invisible, but as she pushed the stack, her other hand slipped a tiny, folded piece of paper underneath it. It was a single, deft motion, a sleight of hand from a broken magician. Maylin, ever the professional, didn't so much as blink. She accepted the stack of legal documents, and with the same smooth motion, her thumb and forefinger secured the hidden note. She placed the documents to one side and discreetly slipped the small paper into her jacket pocket without looking at it. The notary, oblivious, stepped forward. He methodically checked Sabrina's driver's license, compared her face to the photo, and then examined each signature she had just made. Satisfied, he picked up his heavy metal embosser. He placed the first page of the confession on his desk, positioned the seal, and pressed down with both hands. The sound it made was final, a heavy, percussive thump click that echoed off the linoleum floors. It wasn't loud, but it filled the entire room. Thump click. The relinquishment of property. Thump click. The transfer of funds. Each sound was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Sabrina and Nolan's old life. It was a judge's gavel, a closing cell door. It was the period at the end of a long and brutal sentence. When it was done, the notary stacked the papers, now bound by the undeniable force of the law, and took them away to be filed. Sabrina stood up, her shoulders slumped. She didn't look at me. "It's done," she said, her voice a hollow whisper meant for no one. And then she turned and walked out of the room. Not a victor, not a victim, just finished. As Maylin and I stood to leave, she pulled the small folded paper from her pocket. She opened it. It was a single string of numbers and a routing code. "A Swiss bank account in the Cayman Islands," she murmured, a flicker of grudging respect in her eyes. "Croft's personal slush fund, I'd bet. A final, parting gift." It was a small act of vengeance, a piece of ammunition given from one defeated soldier to another. In the hallway, Maylin pulled out her phone. "No time like the present," she said. She made a quick call to Robert's estate lawyer. "John, it's Maylin. We have a confirmed instance of duress. Please activate the springing trust for the Pennington estate. Effective immediately." She hung up. Just like that, Robert's final protective measure, the one he had written about in his letter, was in place. Nolan's inheritance, his safety net, was officially gone. It was now held in a trust that he could not touch until he had met a series of strict, long-term requirements, proving his financial and personal responsibility. It was replaced by a long, hard road to proving he was a man his father could be proud of. Walking out of the county building and into the bright, indifferent sunlight, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no champagne popping in my mind. It wasn't victory, it was equilibrium. The scales, which had been tipped so violently by greed and betrayal, had finally been set right. 6 months can feel like a lifetime, or no time at all. In the quiet, early morning light, watching the silver mist rise off Alder Lake, it felt like both. The ghost of the storm that had torn my life apart had finally passed, leaving behind a sky that was clean, calm, and wide with possibility. The air no longer tasted of betrayal and fear. It smelled of damp earth, pine, and the promise of a new day. My house was a home again, but it was different now. So was I. The front porch, where my daughter-in-law had knelt in the rain, had been reborn. A small, professionally carved wooden sign now hung from one of the beams. It read, "The Pennington Porch, Pro Bono Legal Aid for Seniors, Weekends by Appointment." Mei Lin had thought the idea was brilliant. Every Saturday and Sunday, I would sit here with a few other retired lawyers and paralegals from town. We didn't handle criminal cases or major lawsuits. We read the fine print. We deciphered confusing contracts, explained the terms of reverse mortgages, and helped our neighbors spot the predatory clauses hidden in slick marketing brochures. We were a quiet line of defense for those the world saw as easy targets. On the small wicker table next to my favorite chair, under a smooth stone I used as a paperweight, was a clipping from the local Valley Chronicle. It was 2 weeks old, but I kept it there as a reminder. The headline read, "Aurelius Capital Shelves Controversial Lakeside Resort Project. Cites Environmental Concerns." The article was dry and full of corporate doublespeak about reassessing market viability and commitment to ecological stewardship. I knew the truth. They hadn't developed a conscience. They had simply run the numbers and realized that a protracted public war with the EPA, fueled by Robert's meticulous research, was a battle they couldn't win. They had cut their losses and vanished. Tucked into the corner of my desk blotter inside was a slightly blurry photo that had arrived in the mail last week. It was of Nolan, standing in front of a forest trail sign. He was thinner, his face tanned from working outdoors. He was wearing a simple work shirt with the Nature Conservancy logo on the breast. He was holding up a piece of paper, and though the details were fuzzy, I knew what it was. His first paycheck. He was smiling. It wasn't the weak, haunted smile of the man who had stood silent in my living room, but a real, tired smile. The smile of a man who had done a hard day's work and earned his keep. There was no note with it. None was needed. And in Robert's study, in a simple black frame on a bookshelf, was Sabrina's letter. It had arrived by courier a month after the day at the clerk's office. It was short, brutally honest, and devoid of excuses. It was an apology not for what she had lost, but for what she had done. I framed it not as a trophy of a vanquished enemy, but as a reminder. A reminder that people are rarely as simple as we want them to be. A reminder that even in the wreckage of a terrible choice, a flicker of decency can remain. It was a reminder to me, a woman who had been pushed to the edge of her own humanity, that the world is painted in shades of gray. I took a sip of my tea, the warmth spreading through my hands. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to pierce through the mist, striking the surface of the lake and turning the water from slate gray to shimmering gold. I thought of Robert's letter, of his final words to me. "This land is a promise. I must ask you to be its keeper." For years, he had been the silent guardian of this valley's most precious resource. He had stood as a quiet, unseen shield between a community and a disaster they never knew was coming. The fight I had been forced into, the one that felt so personal, had never truly been about me. It wasn't about a house or a signature or even a son's betrayal. It was about stepping into the role he had left for me. The battle was over, but the work was not. My husband had been its guardian in secret. Now, the duty was mine. And it was a duty I performed in the open. One legal contract, one senior citizen at a time. A circle had closed, and a new, larger one had begun. The sun cleared the ridge, and the water Robert had sworn to protect danced with light. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.